So my job is to be the introducer. So with great thanks to Deputy Secretary Blinken for starting us off, we now have a wonderful panel to drill down on the challenges to investing for impact globally. Our moderator of our panel is Rana Foroohar, who's the assistant managing editor at Time and the economics columnist for Time. She's also CNN's global economic analyst and covers the intersection of economic, business, politics, and foreign affairs. Our panelists are Afsaneh Beschloss, who's the founder and CEO of the Rock Creek Group, which is a leading global investment and advisory firm, which is tasked precisely with what we're talking about today, preserving the assets of public pension funds and sovereign wealth funds to support charitable institutions, universities, colleges, and future generations. We also have Fiona Reynolds, who's the managing director of the Principles for Responsible Investment at the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative. The Principles for Responsible Investment works to understand the investment implications of environmental, social, and governance factors, and to support an international network of signatories who have committed to integrating these factors into their investment decisions. Next is Scott Kalb, who is the chairman of the Sovereign Investor Institute, which is a membership organization and an institutional investor, and also a leading forum for sovereign wealth funds. Scott is the founder and CEO of KLTI Advisors, which is a firm that is dedicated to helping institutional investors build and protect capital over the long term. Most important, Scott Kalb is a fellow with the New America's Bretton Woods II program. Next is Terry Tamminen, who is the CEO of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, which is also dedicated to the long-term health and well-being of all Earth's inhabitants. The foundation works through collaborative partnerships, supporting projects that protect vulnerable wildlife from extinction, and restoring balance to threatened ecosystems. I should say that Terry is also a fellow, an alumnus of New America, where he was a fellow in 2007. And finally, Tomicah Tillemann, who is a leader in the fields of social impact, civic innovation, and diplomacy. He is a senior fellow at New America and the director of our Bretton Woods II initiative, which works with long-term asset holders to reduce their exposure to risk and volatility. And prior to coming to New America, he served as Secretary Clinton's special representative to civil society. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
I got this feeling inside my bones. It goes electric wavy when I turn it on.
Thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to this panel. I'm so excited to moderate you on this incredibly important topic. We've got about 20-30 minutes, so we're going to be incredibly concise and articulate, but feel free to interrupt each other politely. And we're going to tackle really a huge topic, which is what the financial case for sustainable investing is. And I think that the Secretary did a great job of sort of connecting the dots between political and economic risk. We're going to try and drill down on some of that, talk about what's working, what's not working, what the challenges are, what best practices are across the public and private sectors. And we have great representatives here from all of those areas. So let me start actually, Tomicah, with you, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the financial case for this kind of investing. We understand how the risks connect, but what's the sell? What do you tell investors to say, hey, you should be doing this for your good and the good of the planet?
There are two critical arguments here that should be of interest to anyone who is managing assets or deploying assets. And frankly, both of these arguments are pretty new. They didn't exist a little while ago because we didn't have the data to back them up. The first is these are great investments. We just had a discussion upstairs with some of the world's largest companies and biggest asset owners talking about how their investments in social impact and their investments in development were some of the strongest performing elements of their portfolios. So this is tremendously exciting, and they're there is a very strong argument for pursuing these investments purely based on the returns. But it gets even better. And the reason it gets even better is because we are living in a world that is very complex, and by virtue of that complexity, we see a lot of fragility. That fragility can be expensive. And when things go wrong, when we have problems happen around the world, it costs asset owners a lot of money. By investing in solutions to the root causes of some of the biggest challenges that we face on the planet, they can actually help shape the landscape in ways that are going to be more conducive to stability and opportunity and growth over the long term. When you put those together, it's good stuff.
Let me ask you one follow-up question. In terms of fragility and the fact that big events, environmental events, supply chain events, have this incredible cost, was there a particular marker, was there an event that happened where you noticed a real change in people's thinking and a desire to get involved with this kind of investing?
Many of you will remember the Ebola outbreak from a few years ago. And when we looked at the Ebola outbreak, we saw that there were about $32 billion in direct costs associated with that cleanup. But what most people didn't realize is that if you were an investor with exposure to airline stocks, you took it on the chin, because a sovereign wealth fund with a lot of investment in an airline suffered huge, huge losses due to uncertainty about whether people were going to step on a plane. That type of interconnectedness is pretty new, but it's something that we need to incorporate into long-term investment strategies if we're going to solve these challenges.
Okay. Fiona, I want to come to you next. Again, if there's a particular event that you would say was sort of a seismic change in this field, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but also maybe you can give us a couple of the headline numbers on, how these investments do relative to other types of assets.
Sure. Well, I actually think for the PRI's been going for 10 years now. I actually think that one of the biggest changes in the way starting to change people's thinking was the global financial crisis, so 2008, where people said, look, maybe there's a way that we should be doing things differently. And then, of course, there has been a lot of environmental disasters. There's been, corruption issues, all of those sorts of things. The Deepwater Horizon problems, I think, also was something that really brought the issues home to roost for people. So unfortunately, there are so many examples of whether it's financial disaster, whether it's corruption problems, whether it's environmental damage, etc., that happen all the time. And I think the more and more there are, the more that people pay attention. In terms of headline figures, I think, as I said, PRI's been going for 10 years now. We work with the biggest institutional investors in the world. We've got 1,545 signatories, 60 trillion in assets under management. So these are organisations that are looking at the figures. They, they're investing money on behalf of the biggest pension funds on the world, around the world. And I think now that we're 10 years on, there's as that we were talking about, there is now a track record of data. So there's been a lot of meta-studies done. There's been studies done by Oxford, the Warburton School, there's been Harvard's done studies. They all show that you don't have to give up returns because you're considering environmental, social and governance factors. In actual fact, the opposite is true. For us, in considering ESG factors is not about giving up for social good. It's about being a better investor. It's about incorporating a broader sense of risk. It's about investing in companies that are well governed, investing in companies that are going to be around for the long term. So in some ways, it's all really a bit of a no-brainer, I always think. It's all a bit simple, and I often wonder why we still have to have arguments about the fact that a company that considers the environment, considers the society that it invests in, and considers how well it's governed and all of those things wouldn't be a better company.
Okay, I'm going to come back on a couple of those points, but Terry, I think I want to go to you next, because we were talking in the green room a little bit earlier about China, which is, ground zero for a lot of what we're talking about, and also sort of knits together all these different areas that Fiona was talking about, environmental issues and risk, political risk, economic risk. You've done a lot of consulting work in Asian countries, in China. You're focusing on the environment here with your foundation, and you've got some new targets. Maybe you can kind of connect the dots there for us.
Well, certainly, first of all, I want to thank the New America Foundation for putting on this great forum and this great conference. As an alum, I'm very proud of the foundation and the great work that it's done. But yes, China is certainly one of the two biggest polluters in terms of climate change in the world. And that may not have galvanized their attention because, as we know, CO2 doesn't immediately harm public health, but the air pollution that goes up many of the smokestacks along with CO2 does. And increasingly over the last few years, they've realized that this not only leads to a lack of productivity of their citizens, literally killing many of them, costing them a lot of money, but it's also leading to political upheaval. And it's now imperative upon them to keep their economy going, to be able to put people to work and to keep them healthy. And now there's a growing concern by consumers in the supply chain. We see this with the Walmarts of the world and many other large businesses all over the planet that are looking at their supply chains for various sustainability aspects, one of which will be a carbon footprint in the not too distant future, especially as China has now embraced a cap and trade system, which they're just starting to experiment with. So we will have a global price on carbon, I believe, within the next few years.
Okay, I'm going to come back and drill down with you in a minute as well. But Afsaneh, let me ask you, because you're advising a lot of firms across the spectrum. Many of these challenges, China is one, you could name many others, involve the public and private sector having to work together really closely on really complicated, contentious issues. What's best practice? Give us both a challenging story that you've personally dealt with and maybe a positive story that we can say, hold up as an example of how to do things.
So I'll start, how about, with the challenging story.
Okay, good. Yep,
I was on an investment committee where the mission of the organization had to do with having scientists look at climate change, among other things. And the mission was obviously showing us that there are problems, all the things that we just talked about. A member of the board of this investment committee stood up and said, I don't believe in that. And so basically everything we've been discussing in terms of how do we now move our investments towards impact and towards things that we care about got derailed. And that happens a lot. Most people will not be so overt. I'm sure we all sit in committee meetings where people are more polite and they'll say it in a much more subtle way. But I think there is an issue, there's a generational issue. You talked earlier. What at least I'm seeing, I don't know if about the others on the panel, but certainly the millennials are the ones who are putting pressure on the companies these days. The companies are themselves realizing that they have to do this, and that is what is creating the investment opportunities on the one hand. The other thing that I think is worth talking about in terms of the challenges, but also opportunities on the private-public side, is we talk different languages, we use different words when we mean the same thing sometimes. And that can be an issue. So for example, there are different words like impact, like ESG. Now we have the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, which are really important to many of us. So the question is, as you talk about these sorts of things, as in the public sector, how do you translate this to something that the private sector person who needs to look at short-term and medium-term and long-term returns look at? Last, I think it's important to look at thinking, we use the word social impact. A lot of the SDGs are really economic impact, social and economic. And I would love to know others' views on how can we bring the economics so that we can get the partnership between private and public closer to each other.
And just to drill down, is that a clarity issue? Is it basically about making it very clear in very real world terms that the economic has social impact and vice versa, per the China example? Or?
So I'm an economist by training.
Yeah.
I think basically for economists, there are externalities, and sometimes you can't measure those.
Yeah.
Social issues have huge economic costs.
Yeah.
We haven't been able to always measure those. So it's one of the biggest topics that Tomicah just mentioned, we talked a little earlier about, is really this issue of measurement and results. And that is the issue between social and economic.
All right, Scott, I'm going to come to you now. So you're representing sovereign wealth investors. You are, I think, in a club of one, maybe, being a high-level Western investor who's worked with the Korean Sovereign Wealth Fund. What lessons should we take from Asia? What lessons should we take from the long-term investors of the world in general, when we're thinking about the reasons for doing this kind of investing?
So, and Thanks, Rana, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to New America and Concordia for this forum. You know, these institutions, I think there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind. These institutions have enormous amount of capital. So at this institute that I run, we had 280 sovereign fund officials from 60 countries representing assets of, I don't know, 25 to 30 trillion dollars. There's a lot of capital out there. But, you know, this capital must be, I mean, they actually have, as part of their mandate, it's very clear, their mission, they have to have a commercial investment purpose. It's not philanthropy. These guys are providers of long-term capital. They have a very long-term horizon, but they need to generate a return in order to pay for the retirement benefits, the education, the health care of the peoples of their countries or their states. It's very important. So for them to get involved, it has to be clear that they can accomplish their mission. The second thing is that if you think about sort of a risk-return curve, an efficient frontier, you know, a lot of the investments we're talking about are deemed to be high-risk, high-return types of investments. They're in difficult-to-reach places, or there are corruption problems, or there could be terrorism, all sorts of things. So there's actually not as much capital available at that part of the curve, way up at the top end of the curve, the high-risk, high-return capital. So to the extent that we can have initiatives that will mitigate some of that risk and drive these investments towards the middle of the curve, we free up more and more capital that can get involved. So I think that's an important role for government. There are a lot of initiatives out there already. I think we're making progress.
Do you find that the pension fund, you know, crisis and the idea that we're living in a world of probably lower returns? I mean, if some of the smartest people in the world are saying that, is that lighting a fire under people about all of this?
Well, I think it provides an opportunity. We don't have to provide enormous returns in order to attract, again, risk-adjusted returns, in order to attract this capital. I mean, so that's the opportunity. And so, for example, we're seeing some pretty good initiatives in infrastructure around the world, in the developing world. A lot of activity there. Mid to, you know, high single-digit returns. That's pretty good. A nice regulated return. And, you know, we have a problem. We need something like $2 trillion a year of spending in infrastructure, and our development banks, you know, around the world collectively have about 200 billion that they can invest in this area. So we need a 10-to-1 ratio. So we need initiatives that are going to be able to put that capital to work and then, you know, encourage 10-to-1 in terms of participation. You can do that if you have the right structures. And you need to, you need to message this. It's getting back to what Afsaneh was saying. You need to message this right. The guys in this, in the government fund world, the pension fund, the sovereign fund world, you know, they need, you know, they need to you need to make it clear that, hey, that these investments make sense, that you can have a positive impact, social impact, and also generate returns you need. You need to provide them with the tools that they require to analyze their portfolios, to see what they're already doing and what else needs to be done. They need to be able to see that they can actually work in this field and right alongside their missions.
Go ahead, jump in.
If I could just quickly add to that, you hit it on the head, but I would also just add that, as you know, institutional investors all have different asset classes and buckets they're working with. And so if you're the guy who is responsible, or the lady who's responsible for publicly listed assets, well, you may not be able to find a lot of publicly listed companies that meet the kind of true sustainability criteria we're talking about today. Infrastructure actually is another difficult one, just for a whole variety of reasons. Bonds typically are providing bonds to governments or to those very same companies that are publicly listed. So you're getting to a narrower and narrower subset of asset classes that you're really trying to attract into this field, at least to get started, and that's typically either venture or private equity. And that's why I think things like the Aligned Intermediaries program that was launched at the White House last July a year ago, July, and the Planet Pledge Fund that the DiCaprio Foundation is putting together is a chance for institutional investors to come together to learn how can you find opportunities in those asset classes, or perhaps redefine those classes a little bit more broadly so that you can use capital from those different sources.
Okay, that's interesting. So we only have a few minutes left. Let me just ask a couple final questions. Fiona, there are 17 sustainable development goals. That's a lot. That's a lot of metrics to work with. We've heard a little bit about different tactics for investors that want to get involved in this area, but how would you frame it? I mean, what's most important on that list? Where should people start? How should they think about these goals?
Sure. So when we've talked to our members about the issues of the Sustainable Development Goals, because many of them are very interested, again, they want to invest in the Sustainable Development Goals, but they need projects that are investable and scalable. And the Sustainable Development Goals that interest them most are around climate change adaptation, so renewable energy projects, for example, water, new water models, all of those sorts of things that are to do with climate. Then, of course, there's sustainable infrastructure, so that's obviously a big interest to investors. There's investments in sustainable cities as well, property, etc., property that's built in a sustainable way. So there is plenty of things there there are plenty of things there for investors. So we say to them, well, let's look at the ones that are really investable and scalable as a starting
global.
point.
Those are all global. Afsaneh, you want
I was just going to add to what Fiona said. In addition to the hard sectors that she mentioned, a couple of the SDGs, maybe 6 or 7 of them, include those. Plus, I would say health and education are also key. We talked about that also. Health sector, education sector are both sectors that have generated pretty high returns. And if you look at the MSCI, only 1% right now, or less than 1%, is in health sector in emerging markets. And one of the fastest growing areas in the world is health sector in emerging markets. Obviously, one of the other SDGs is employment. Everything we're talking about today is about also generating jobs and employment.
Go ahead, Tomicah.
One quick point, because I think Afsaneh raises some excellent suggestions. One of the components of the Bretton Woods II effort is to build out analytics that will help us identify which sectors are going to be most beneficial in a given country at a given time. And that type of analytics work is, again, something that we've never been able to do previously, but the data is there now. And to the extent we can put those tools to use, we can have, I think, great returns for investors and a great impact for society.
So I know you're at the beginning of this, but I'm incredibly fascinated if you had any hints about where you see that going. What's the data telling you so far? Would you have any sort of early previews of
well, there's some very
areas?
exciting findings emerging from this, and it also, frankly, speaks to some different strategies that asset owners should be pursuing.
Yeah.
One of the most important things that we've learned to date is that there's a very powerful relationship, perhaps predictably, between the quality of rule of law within a society and the ratio of capital market to GDP, so essentially how big your stock market is going to get as a percentage of your economy. What we've seen happen in the public sector over the last decade is that there have been initiatives like the Millennium Challenge Corporation that will say to a government, in essence, we will bring investment capital to the table if you meet certain baseline standards of accountability and transparency. I think there's a real opportunity, and again, we're seeing some very smart funds start to apply these types of provisions to their investment strategies for big institutional actors to do the same thing. And in essence, say to governments, we will bring money to the table if you can create an environment where there's going to be trust and accountability. And that's a very powerful new tool.
I think there's also, investors are looking for new opportunities, and there's been the Paris Agreement signed as well as the SDGs. And we were talking about China before. Well, China has just had the G20 presidency. It has embraced the issue of climate and green finance and has put in place a lot of innovation in financial instruments and is doing a whole lot. The US has been extremely slow to come to these issues. It's been one of the slowest countries to embrace environmental, social and governance opportunities for investors. And so I think, you know, countries have to have a bit of competition about where's the investor money going to go.
That's interesting. Scott, you wanted to jump in?
So, yeah, I was just going to say, you know, we've been talking about the SDGs, and, you know, we had a very stirring speech from Deputy Secretary Blinken, and we think a lot about these issues. But when it comes to sort of catalyzing, mobilizing this capital, this investment capital, a lot of those initiatives are just not appropriate. So I don't mean to pour cold water on it, but it's going to be hard for these institutions to invest in the refugee crisis or in terrorism or in solving corruption. Those things become, you know, I think what you need to do is, first of all, I think we need to reframe the discussion. So, you know, for most people, when you say, well, how you should invest in the SDGs, they go, excuse me? You know, what are we talking about here? So let's make it more granular. You know, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of money that's being invested in education. You know, probably many of you have invested in education stocks or companies. You know, education has a tremendously positive social impact. Healthcare, as Afsaneh was saying, infrastructure, microfinance. So what you really need to do is, I think, frame it as saying, okay, these are very good sectors you can invest in, that you can make an appropriate risk-adjusted return, you can have a positive impact. And I think the ancillary benefit is that maybe if we're helping to improve the social fabric, civil society in these countries, then we will reduce corruption and we will reduce maybe the impetus for terrorism. But we can't tackle those things directly.
Okay, so we've got just 3 minutes left. Let's do a speed round and go down the line here. We've heard a lot about the need and the availability of data, but the need for better analytics, better definition of the problem and the potential solutions, possibly a fine-tuning of the cell in terms of what is actually being targeted. What else would you all like to see, and what's the low-hanging fruit here? What levers do you imagine pushing, or would you like to see pushed in the next, couple of years? Tomicah, you start.
I think there's an extraordinary window of opportunity right now to put in place tax and regulatory frameworks that incentivize this type of investment and help manage the risks around these investments and make it clear that it's crazy to have a society where investors see the same regulatory and risk benefits from investing in a casino that they do from investing in health infrastructure. And yet that's what we have in most places right now.
It's so ripe for so many things. I love
it. It is, but
that's another panel. We won't start on that.
Agreed.
Terry, go ahead.
Well, let me speak from the foundation perspective. Being in philanthropy, I think there's a huge role for philanthropy to play in this sector, because a little bit of money invested in some of the NGOs that are demystifying some of these problems or coming up with good policy solutions and sharing them with different governments can have a profound impact. Just to give you a very quick example, the R20 Regions of Climate Action is one that when Governor Schwarzenegger and I left state government in California, we founded with the UN, and by working in Brazil with local cities who wanted to retrofit their streetlights with modern LEDs that save 60% of the energy, we discovered what their problems were. We brought in intermediaries to try to help them with the technology, the policy, and the finance. And the bottom line was that within 2 years, we had set up a $500 million special purpose finance vehicle to give cities the money to retrofit their streetlights and pay it back from the savings. And the investors were guaranteed by the local utility taxes. So it worked for everybody, but it did take a little bit of grant money to go in there and have someone figure out what were those barriers and problems for the cities, the technology providers, and the investors to finally work together. And then all of a sudden, a huge for-market opportunity was unlocked. So I would say the foundations of the world have a great role to play in investing in that on their philanthropic side, but then also realizing many of these are bigger than a lot of pension funds, and they should be putting their money increasingly where their mouth is.
Great point. Scott?
I think that for starters, there are a lot of great initiatives out there, but I think that they're they tend to be somewhat fractured, they're scattered, they're small scale, they're doing good things, but they're focused in one particular area, one particular geography. So one thing I think we need is more, and I'm happy to hear about Terry's initiative. I think we need scalable solutions where we can sort of pull things together, have transparency, institutional quality, something that meets the needs of the capital that we'd like to attract. Another thing I'd like to see is we do have, there's certain, as I was saying before, there's certain kinds of investments that these big institutions can't really do. They're not really set up to invest in high-risk greenfield, startup, a shovel in the ground type of projects. But that's the kind of thing that development banks can do. And what I'd like to see is development banks or some of these other official institutions starting those projects, de-risking them, and then sell them. Sell them for a profit. I mean, so, because the institutions are more capable of investing in brownfield than greenfield. So get it going, de-risk it, keep some money in it, but then, so that the institutions feel comfortable, and then sell it. And then redeploy that capital so you're getting a multiplier effect.
Okay.
Put it back into those greenfield.
So creating kind of ecosystem with different layers of investing.
Yes.
Fiona, go ahead.
I think better regulation around how companies report and think about environmental, social and governance factors for investors, that is done in a consistent way. I also think that the US doesn't, for example, have a stewardship code, whereas many other countries do, for investors to be talking about how they manage their money could be another issue. I think there's a lot of confusion around fiduciary duty in the US as well.
Absolutely.
And investment consultants in this country are an incredible roadblock to investing, and I think asset owners also listen to those investment consultants like they are the fiduciary, like they have to, not in a way that they are giving you advice. So I think that there could be better, there should be more clarity around fiduciary duty. There has been some things done, but I think there could be a lot more done here. And I think the other thing for investors is, of course, policy certainty to be able to go into big, large and long-scale projects. And I just talked about China before. So you've got China with climate going full steam ahead on a whole lot of issues. And you've got in the US, Donald Trump saying he's cancelling climate change.
God, we're not going to go to politics. We've got a minute 32 left.
I think policy certainty is important, however, for large-scale investing.
Okay, Afsaneh, last word.
I love Scott's idea on climate and energy, because at the World Bank, we used to do a lot of that, as you remember. And I think there's a lot of future for the World Bank being the green bank, among other things. The other area, which I think is going to be huge, is fintech. And that is going to hopefully bring lot of low-cost finance and efficient finance and be very profitable, both in this country where banking sector has been slow to come to the poorest. And in emerging markets.
Well, that's a great note, positive note to end on. If finance and technology together could be sort of a disruptive force for good, as well as a challenge, that would be a great place to go. So thank you all. Great panel, great audience. Thanks so much.